Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the School of Design at George Brown College and to this special presentation prepared by the students of the Interdisciplinary Design Strategy program at the Institute Without Boundaries. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. George Brown College is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and other Indigenous people who have lived here over time. We're grateful to share this land as treaty people, with the treaty being the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, who learn, work, and live in the community with each other. So on that note, I just want to congratulate this graduating class on their incredible work this year. The work at the Institute Without Boundaries is really a special endeavor. We bring together people from various disciplines who collaborate with each other intensively over a year and work on a real-life project and real-life challenge that is of critical importance to people around the world. And the challenge that they're facing today, and that they've been working on over the past year, is the challenge of climate-ready communities and the challenge of the climate migration that is going to be confronting us as people are experiencing climate change and are going to have to change where they're living and are going to have to move, and the upheaval that that's going to bring to our societies. And so not a simple challenge to deal with, but they have dealt with it in an extraordinary way. And to help you understand the kind of process and work that they undertake, they start the year with meeting each other from their various diverse and different backgrounds. They learn to communicate and understand each other and to think together and to create together solutions. And those solutions involve working with people in the community, with stakeholders that are from the problem area that they're dealing with. And then they're visited at points in the year by other students from around the world, by many, many industry professionals who they contact with. This year, the class worked with the Accenture Human Sciences Studio in Dublin, who was our main partner for the project. But they've worked with students from many, many different universities. And then as they bring the project together and bring their ideas together near the end of the semester, they enlist other students from other George Brown programs and from other parts of the world to help them realize the vision of their project. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to the students for them to share their findings, their research, their knowledge with you. I'm sure you're going to be impressed and leave the room with more insight about these problems and also the possible solutions that might exist to them.
Thank you, Luigi. As he just mentioned, we are a very interdisciplinary group, so we're just going to take a second to introduce our backgrounds and where we come from. I'm Jenna. I grew up about 2 hours northwest of Toronto. I graduated from OCAD University about 11 years ago now. I studied integrated media, which was film installation and furniture design. And now I'm was at the Interdisciplinary Design program at the IWB to try and use my art and design skills for some good.
Hi, I'm JP Carrillo. I'm from Mexico City. I studied visual communication back in Mexico City, and I graduated 5 years ago. Now I'm moving into the design strategy realm. And yes, a random fact, I was a dancer for 14 years. So there you go.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm also known as the baby of the group. I just graduated very recently in 2021, and now I started, from the University of Toronto in architecture, and I just started the IDS program about a week later. I'm originally from Toronto, but I've also lived in Boca Raton, Florida for 6 years and then came back. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Daksh. I'm from India. I have a background in architecture as well. So since I've been here, I already started working with this firm called Moser Associates as an architectural designer, and I've been trying to manage this course alongside that. But yeah, I have a background in architecture, and now I can say that I have a background in design strategy as well.
Hi, I am Migs Tapasha. I'm an industrial designer from the Philippines. I was practicing furniture design and manufacturing for 5 years before coming here. I came to the IWB to broaden my knowledge on design strategy since I have that background already in production and organization. And so far, it's been great. Exciting to have all you guys here.
Hello, my name is San. I'm from Shanghai, China. I graduated from McGill University with a bachelor degrees in life sciences. And yeah, now I'm sorry, I will be like a fresh new graduate from IDS program.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Shashank. I'm an artist and an architect from India. I'll be taking you through the first part of the presentation. Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank Luigi for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for making the effort to come all the way here on a Tuesday. This will be worth your time, I promise. So every year, as Luigi indicated, a small group of diverse individuals, like very diverse. Look at us. We're like a box of assorted donuts. So we come together for this interdisciplinary program to research and develop a real-world solution and also have fun along the way. Our goal this year was to investigate and develop what it takes to build a climate-ready community and to comprehend the implications of climate change and migration. Well, to begin, I'm presuming that we all believe that there's a climate crisis happening. So one day when our homes are no longer habitable, where will we go? That's the big question. You're probably all wondering what connects us all together, like us as a cohort to this issue, other than like donuts. And more broadly, what connects all of you in Toronto to a vast and unapproachable topic such as climate migration? Well, let me set the stage for you. Last weekend on Saturday, Ontario experienced a severe storm. For many of us, this storm was no more than like a 60-minute inconvenience. Was any of y'all like affected by it? Raise your hand if you saw the emergency on your phone. Yes? Yes? Where are you coming from today? Yeah, so. Do you mind sharing your experience on that day? Very unpredictable and scary, isn't it? Yeah. So how many of you live in the core of downtown? For some of us living in downtown core of Toronto, our power might have gone out for a maximum of 20 minutes. How many of you are coming from the GTA, like Vaughan or Brampton? Anyone from Brampton? Where are my people at? Nobody? There are a few. Anyway, if you live or ventured out north or east over the weekend, you might have seen trees ripped out of the ground, scattered across sidewalks. But if you live in Ajax, you might have had no power for over 24 hours. If you live in Peterborough, you would have experienced a state of emergency prompted by the county. 3 days ago, at least 10 fatalities were confirmed as a result of this disaster. So what did we learn from this one instance of climate disaster that affected us all in different levels of severity so close to home? Climate migration refers to the movement of individuals or groups of people from a region that has been impacted by the effects of climate to a new location. This movement is not limited to the after effects of a disaster, but is also a meaningful adaptation strategy to climate change effects. In the event of the storm surge in Toronto, while it definitely doesn't spark the idea of what we traditionally think in terms of migration, it can teach us all a few lessons in terms of climate change's impact on people and communities. Design solutions for climate migrants must understand the context that precedes mass movement. It must understand the needs of vulnerable communities, where they are heading, and what opportunities the gaps in the system can reveal before, during, and after the migration process. It means understanding what services must be provided to both potential migrants and host communities so that impact and benefits are equitably balanced. In design terms, this means fully understanding the problem space before ideating solutions. Or how my girlfriend says it, don't jump to conclusions. At the beginning of this term, looking at the space with no background, we all began with a series of framing questions like, who are the people migrating due to climate change? What are the large and small scale consequences of climate change effects? Where are the communities that people are migrating from and to? When must direct action be implemented to mitigate these effects? Why does climate change cause people to migrate? How might we both mitigate these effects and support those at the forefront of climate-related risk? And the most important question, who let the dogs out? Once we broke down this massive problem into a series of systematic questions, we were able to better approach our understanding. Through a sequence of research methods such as precedent scan, subject matter expert interviews, and data analysis, we produced a research report. We found that low-lying coastal and desert nations in the global south with more extreme climates had greater vulnerability to climate risk. This is not only due to their exposure, but also due to their decreased social protections that would increase community resilience. And climate risks are not limited to direct climate impacts. When a nation is dependent on a particular natural resource that is impacted by climate change, political and economic instability can ensue, causing people to move to new countries or cities within the same country, or even seek refugee status. Take Syria, for example. In 2021, Syria experienced the worst drought in over 70 years. This was magnified by the privatization of water underlying the civil war. So, for a Syrian refugee, they might not identify as a climate migrant, but their reasons for relocating are embedded into a complex intersection of geography, political conflict, and degradation of natural environment. The status of a climate refugee is currently not protected under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, meaning 25 million people globally that would otherwise be considered refugees cannot claim this legal status. This statistic is even more jarring when you consider the human implications of existing in a legal limbo. In 2020, Mr. Loan Titiota from a small island of Kiribati attempted to claim refugee status in New Zealand due to his nation's severe climate risks. With sea level rise expected to displace the entire national population in as little as 10 years, he brought this case to international court. His claim was rejected, producing a historical precedent for restricting the mobility of climate-induced migration cases worldwide. So you see how difficult it can actually be to classify a climate migrant. It would be easy to reduce the definition of a climate migrant to those two words, a relocation due to climate change impacts. In more recent years, this definition has created political controversy. But when considering all the compounding social, economic, and political factors that actually compel an individual to move, we realize that a legal definition would minimize the entire experience of an individual. Therefore, to identify different situations of climate-related displacement, we constructed a set of spectrums to map varying experiences of a climate migrant. The first spectrum is urgency. This time-based spectrum maps climate migrants on a scale of most rapid relocation processes to more gradually paced relocation processes. Their needs vary based on the time to plan for resettlement. First, we have environmental emergency migrants who have been exposed to a natural disaster and need to relocate immediately after an event. Next, forced environmental migrants experience a lessening quality of life and livelihood due to increased exposure to climate risks, initiating their need to relocate with the intent of decreasing such exposure. Lastly, we have environmental motivated migrants experience a slower onset of exposure to climate risks, enabling them to plan and relocate over a greater amount of time. The next spectrum is geography. This space-based spectrum maps climate migrants on a scale according to the distance traveled to relocate and reveals their unique needs. A person whose exposure to climate change has prompted resettlement in another country is called an external migrant. The most pressing needs are legal status and access to support and services. Climate risk has prompted internally displaced persons to relocate within their country, most likely from a rural region to an urban region, with the intent of decreasing such exposure. Adjusting to a higher density community will be the priority. Last but not the least, people who have not migrated either because they are not significantly affected by climate change or unable to migrate due to individual barriers are non-migrants. They need resiliency, planning, and emergency materials. With better understanding of different types and needs of migrants, we are able to conceive climate-ready communities in the context of climate migration. Communities will also face varying levels of impact. Some nations like Kiribati are already facing their homes being uninhabitable due to sea level rise and tropical disasters. Some will experience a slower onset effect of climate change, such as Syria, where the ongoing drought will have material consequences on communities over a longer period of time. And some communities like Canada will experience a lower risk of climate disaster, but have to accommodate for the implications of mass migration. With Canada already fourth in the world for migrant acceptance, our push towards becoming climate ready will be determined by the ability and expand our existing infrastructural and social services to act as a paradigm for sustainable growth. Now, I'll hand it over to my friend Daksh to take you through our strategies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shashank. So, well, now that you have a brief understanding about the problem, I know what you're thinking, that how is it possible to produce a holistic strategy for climate-ready communities while also considering the context of climate migration, right? So, well, you're not alone. We came to a point in our process that directed us towards these tensions of designing climate-ready communities. So we asked ourselves this question, that how can we build systems that will incorporate the needs of all people, communities, and natural environments in the context of climate change? Through our research, we derived 9 insights that translated into a holistic framework for designing climate-ready communities. In the strategy, as you can see, we put people at the very center. So people are assets to climate-ready communities. They provide knowledge systems, skills, cultural experience, and resources that better position communities to respond to the climate change. Migrants shape our communities. Here in Toronto, we have built off a cultural mosaic of migration patterns that embed a unique value in the city. So with people at the center, designing climate-ready communities will be a collaborative process, and hence we need to recognize those identities and leverage diversity, equity, agency, and empathy for not only the newcomers, but also the host communities and the natural ecosystems that exist around us. Talking about diversity, it is critical to any ecosystem success and community preparedness. The diversity of the existing natural ecosystems can pave the way for replication into other systems. The redundancy of species prevents systematic failure. If one species experiences any disruption, built-in redundancies will step in to provide a similar function. We call this principle of applying repetition. So we can extend this idea of functional diversity to infrastructural systems. So those infrastructural systems can prevent failure in the face of climate adversity. When we expand and decentralize our civic structure, such as power grids, Wi-Fi networks, and even naturalized public spaces, we will be able to protect our communities holistically to bounce back after disruptions. So now, to put this in context with the example that Shashank just quoted earlier, so if the principle of reduced failures were to be applied equitably across both rural and urban communities throughout Ontario, the impacts of the storm that we witnessed on Saturday would have been evenly distributed and therefore drastically reduced. Next is empathy, so which should exist in all people enduring similar or different experiences. Once we redefine our boundaries of what is considered a climate migrant, we will be able to effectively account for the compounding factors that might prompt a migrant to move. This would entail providing effective and regular migration paths for employment and legal opportunities to climate migrants that empathize with their individual needs. Similarly, we must address variables, considering its impacts on different communities. So some communities need mitigation strategies for climate disasters, while others require adaptation strategies for sustainable growth. A climate-ready community will be shaped by empathetic responses to the differing material needs of individuals and communities affected by climate impacts at different points. Then we have equity. So equity is necessary on a global and community scale to sufficiently attend to those experiencing elevated exposure to climate change. So we need to eliminate the exposures. Eliminating exposures for vulnerable populations in a climate-ready community means attending to the needs of at-risk communities abroad as well as in our homes. So by ensuring equal access opportunities to housing and food security for individuals in the urban centers, we will also be preparing for the population influx that is going to happen with climate migration. So therefore, we must distribute the resources that provide protection against climate risk. Those with less access to the financial resources tend to be more vulnerable populations, which also lack the ability to form any resilient community. By redistributing resources equitably on local and global economic scales, we will ensure social and fiscal responsibility among the most dominant economic engines to contribute to actively shaping the climate-ready communities that we desire. Then finally, we have agency. Agency is a fundamental concept to human beings and their ability to choose and define their own experiences. The agency of an individual to self-identify will empower them with social and economic protections that allow them to integrate into a new society. The experience of climate migration for some will mean an emotional trauma akin to the grief of leaving their home. For others, climate migration means an opportunity for mobility, financial stability, and independence. We must embrace the different perspectives across the entire emotional spectrum to account for the needs of all the migrants. The migration process is not a fixed linear journey that ends once a migrant has reached their destination. We must take into account that the concept of home for many is a continuum. By reimagining our home, we can provide for the needs of migrants before, during, and after their journeys, implementing services that will respect a migrant's desire to stay, continue their migrant journey, or return to their origin community. We translated the strategic framework into a series of posters. Each poster prompts the user with a question on how they must consider this principle in the planning of their own climate-ready community. So you might as well use these when it comes to building those climate-ready communities. So for each principle, we designed a shape to represent that action that the framework prompts. Although the core messaging revolves around people, you will not see any explicit portraits of human beings because a climate migrant can be anyone. It can be you, it can be me, or anyone. So let us change our perceptions of migration and those that are affected. So with that, now to help you understand how we might put this strategic framework into action, I'll hand it over to Rebecca, who will highlight some of the projects we have created throughout the year, which may contribute to building those climate-ready communities.
Thank you, Daksh. So how can you actually apply this framework, or how can we apply this framework as a cohort or as a community to our everyday actions and large-scale projects? Well, this past February, our cohort hosted an international charrette over the course of 1 week with over 100 participants, partnered with both academic institutions and organizations from Toronto, Dublin, Paris, Milan, and Nairobi. This fast-paced design sprint allowed the cohort to brainstorm and develop 9 projects that address issues unique to climate migration in the form of built environment, education and work, and support and services. Utilizing our climate-ready community strategy, we selected 3 projects and developed them for further feasibility as exemplar projects of our strategy in action. Our first project, Care for You, applies the 3 principles of redefining boundaries, embracing perspectives, and reimagining home to the mental health needs of climate disaster victims and climate-anxious populations. We zoomed into the case study of Leiden in British Columbia to understand the immediate and long-term intervention points for communities at risk of disaster. In 2021, Leiden experienced a devastating wildfire that destroyed much of its built infrastructure, necessitating a community relocation. Over 1,200 residents were evacuated from the site, causing a spur in mental health crises among the population. Even children were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a direct result. The broader implications of this disaster led 75% of Canadians to admit to experiencing some degree of climate-related anxiety. But what if we created a multi-network support system for mental health intervention at the same degree as physiological support, so that both pre- and post-disaster victims were able to form mental resilience at community and individual scales? Care for You is the people who heal. We are an emerging program that introduces climate-informed therapy to help individuals manage eco-anxiety and recover from disaster-induced trauma before, during, and after disasters through a wide variety of psychological services. We offer mental health first aid in the aftermath of disasters, as well as long-term follow-up. We leverage reliable resources and information from trustworthy organizations such as the Red Cross to equip people with knowledge and tools to prepare for recurrent disasters with strengthened psychological resilience. We offer 3 main services: climate-informed therapy at the site of disaster, group-facilitated exercises that help build community resilience, and a digital app that acts as long-term follow-up and a resource database. As a joint program of Red Cross Canada, users will be able to access psychological first aid and climate-informed therapy in Care for You tents and referral to other Red Cross services that address basic needs. Climate-aware therapists and volunteers are familiar with the multidimensional aspects of the climate crisis and its impact on social and psychological well-being, helping people cope with eco-anxiety and grief and building mental health resilience. Group-facilitated climate activities will be conducted in confidential and inclusive spaces. People with shared traumatic experiences will be able to share their own stories and feelings. Climate risk and anxious populations can create social connection and build a sense of community, as well as increase climate awareness through group activities. Users will be able to access reliable resources, information, and tools regarding local emergency services and disaster preparedness via the Care for You app. Our second project, Get Up and Grow, applies the 3 principles of applying repetition, recognizing identities, and reducing failures to the urban centers experiencing influxes of agricultural migrants. For this project, we analyzed the site of Mexico City and its surrounding regions to create a holistic framework for leveraging the agricultural skills of newcomers. The ongoing effects of climate change expose rural regions at higher levels to negative impacts. For example, the increased exposure to drought in rain-fed dependent crops such as maize has already prompted a steady decline in food production, causing over 80 million agricultural jobs to be lost globally. In Mexico, this has led to a 15% decrease in incomes, causing many to move internally to seek employment in urban areas such as Mexico City. Yet, once these communities move, they do not have the skills suitable to work in urban centers. This has caused a proliferation of underemployment and pockets of poverty in the neighborhoods on the outskirts of city centers. But what if we created a systemic framework that employs internal migrants and leverages their agricultural skill sets for sustainable development in urban communities? Get Up and Grow is the people who build. We are an innovative social enterprise that matches agricultural migrants to local urban agricultural opportunities. We offer secure, dignified jobs to skilled newcomers and promote climate resilience and ecosystem diversity in urban areas. We leverage the agricultural skilled climate migrants to execute urban greening projects for private and community clients. We offer 3 main services: consultation and design proposals, utilizing years of agricultural experience that incorporate regenerative and sustainable approaches to gardening in urban spaces, legal support to procure special zoning permissions and grants for green development, and planting and maintenance services provided by skilled agriculturalists. As a social enterprise aiming at urban greening expansion and ecosystem diversity, users can fully apply their extensive agricultural experience on the execution of green projects for private clients, including material procurement, initial installation and setup, and regular maintenance. They will collaborate with designers to create a comprehensive project proposal for clients that consider the site-specific spatial planning and layout of built interventions, such as vertical gardens, as well as the most appropriate vegetation. Local municipalities, as strategic partners of Get Up and Grow, provide extenuating permissions to private green development projects, including obtaining approvals and procuring additional financial grants. In the long term, agricultural migrants will be able to achieve self-sufficiency through dignified and secure employment opportunities, while local communities can benefit from economic growth as well as increasing urban greenery. Our third project, Remate, applies the 3 principles of distributing resources, addressing variables, and eliminating exposures to external migrants who support their communities back home through the form of remittances. As previously mentioned, many individuals who emigrate from an at-risk community will do so with the intention of financially supporting family members in their origin communities. Remittances finance $780 billion of the global GDP a significant market share based on decentralized mutual aid and social infrastructure. This is most evident in the case study of the Philippines, the 8th most vulnerable country in the world to climate effects due to its coastal geographic location and lack of social protections. Yet the Philippines also contributes to one of the largest market shares of global remittance flows, with 10% of its national GDP attributed to remittances. Over 600,000 people migrate from the Philippines to Canada every year with the intention of working as overseas Filipino workers to send remittances to their family members. These remittances are important resources in building individual resilience, but are not utilized enough to build community resilience for larger scale adaptation in the face of climate risk. But what if we created a centralized system to activate the large market share of remittance flows while redistributing the wealth of dominant corporations to produce a sense of social responsibility for the communities who require resources to build resilience? Remate is the people who support. We are a user experience layer embedded into trustworthy remittance services such as Remitly that incentivize external migrants to reinvest in local climate resilience back home. We offer donation matching and rewards through our corporate partnerships to increase our market reach. We leverage the widespread market share of remittance users across the globe to create visibility for both emerging climate ventures and corporate social responsibility. We offer 3 main services: supporting the development of entrepreneurial activation in origin communities by selecting site-specific projects that will build community resilience, an improved user experience during the remittance transaction process that provides complete transparency for sender donations, and a donation matching and reward system partnered with corporations to increase market visibility and corporate social responsibility. Strategic partnerships enlisted with multinational corporations provide investment support as well as consumer reward system to boost engagement among remittance senders and garner social responsibility among corporations with access to the most financial resources. The Remate Research and Development Team will act as a liaison for local climate-ready ventures in emerging economies to ensure best practices are adequately assessed and supported, in addition to communicating status updates for Remate donors. The remittance sender experience is central to Remate's strategy. An embedded UX layer is activated on partnered remittance platforms during the transactional process, inviting users to support the community they are sending remittances to through small-scale donations and post-use engagement updates. Remate facilitates transactional flows between remittance senders, corporate donors, and recipients in origin communities in order to build climate resilience on community and individual scales through local investments. To view all these projects, as well as our research outcomes and selected practices from around the world, we encourage you to visit or to immerse yourself in our website. In a nutshell, this website will serve as a digital archive of our work that you, our collaborators, may use as a starting point to shape your own climate-ready community. Just visit climateready.ca to view it. As you're also all probably aware, we have set up an exhibition for you to view the outcomes of our research. This exhibition will physically present our principles in action, as well as the ways you can interact with our projects in this very space to stimulate collective action. For those of you joining us digitally today, the exhibition launch will be visible via live stream after the conclusion of this presentation. It will also be available to explore in 3D on our website through an interactive digital model. So before we wrap up, we'd like to conclude with an acknowledgement of all the partners and faculty members that have made this year's project come to life. Not only have you been assets to our core research and development, but you have been assets to building climate-ready communities all around the world. The Institute Without Boundaries has given us, a cohort of 7 people from all over the world with backgrounds across disciplines, the opportunity to impact change collectively. And that change will begin here in this space with you all. So let's open up for a Q&A before we head out to the exhibition launch. If you're watching the live stream, feel free to ask questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them as many as time allows. Please join us after the Q&A upstairs in room 331 for our exhibition. You will find this space directly above us and down the hall in the Future Ways of Living lab. We will have drinks and snacks for your enjoyment, and kindly leave your masks on when not consuming food or beverage so that we can keep everyone safe. Thank you all. Does anyone have any questions for us? Yes, Arjit. Oh.
I think the first thing that comes to mind is, as people that are like all of us that are here, what do you suggest should be the first step that we should take to be a part of this project, right? How can we take this and move forward with it?
Well, the first step for us was to acknowledge what's happening, to acknowledge the concept of migration, that climate migration is a thing. Who are climate migrants? Once we understand that, we would realize that, okay, the problems of climate migrants are actually the problems that we face daily when we are maybe addressing those design challenges. It's all the same. So I think that would be a great first step. But if you're already familiar with the concept of climate migration, what you can do is just refer to the principles and use them as, let's say, these are the SDGs that you could use to build those climate ready communities as a designer. I think that would be it. That answers your question.
Any other questions from the audience?
Why should Canada be a leader in accepting climate migrants?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and something that we were struggling with a lot at the beginning of this this research process. We were sort of honed in on the idea of Canada as creating this model acceptance program. But at the same time, there was no real research to back it up at this point. We were kind of coming in and just saying Canada because we are all based in Canada at the very moment, or for the people joining us digitally, I guess not, but we'll keep them aside for now. But I think a lot of the research that we actually did like post that initial decision supported us, like honestly, on that initial insight. Why Canada? Because Canada has already placed fourth in the world for the acceptance of all migrants worldwide. Canada also has, in 2018, signed on to the UN Compact for regular, safe, and legal migration, which actually acknowledges as one of its points to basically assess the needs of people facing disasters and creates regular and safe migration pathways for them. However, that compact is not legally binding, as we see. So there really isn't a formal there isn't a formal migration pathway right now, or migration acceptance program specifically for climate migrants. But Canada already has this system that they've set up that can be expanded upon, and in certain pilot projects that they've already initiated, such as the rural northern immigration pilot program, where they are accepting migrants from all around the world to work in agricultural spaces that don't have enough a very large population that are basically facing underemployment right now, to basically match them with rural communities. Right now, Canada actually is projected to have a population growth of up to, I think, 100 million by the end of 2030, I believe, 2050, by the end of the century, sorry. But we actually have a lot more space than that. So a lot of the opportunities that research has suggested is to expand communities right now, communities experiencing underpopulation, essentially, and that need to kind of bounce back and be a little bit more resilient, whose industries are failing. There is a really good opportunity for migrants to step in, and they've already paved the way that Canada operates at the moment. As Doc mentioned, it's like a cultural mosaic of different backgrounds. So if we kind of continue along this path, I think the next step is to include climate migrants in this bigger structure, this grander scheme of policy and legal pathways for migration. Thank you.
Hello. So from your research, what do you think is the main difference between climate migration and any other type of migration? And how are your principles particularly relevant to climate migration and not like economical migration or violence migration? what's the main thing there?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And it was difficult to come to that conclusion. Data on climate migration specifically is really hard to find. What we define as climate migration, people end up actually migrating as economic migrants or political migrants. And what we realized is that climate is actually often a layer added to those different current legal means of migration. Our framework is and technically could probably be applied to all types of migration, but that is reflected in the research that often people migrate to Canada, for instance, for economic reasons, but that does not mean that they're not climate migrants. We tried to really isolate the drivers of climate migration, but it ends up being really, really hard to find, specific data on people that will move just because of a natural disaster. Often those people end up migrating within their own countries. The people that migrate externally are often economic or political migrants. So when we're talking about receiving communities, and we're based here in Toronto, so we're talking about these principles, potentially Toronto being the first place that they're implemented. We might be talking about external migrants that are coming here that may actually identify as being economic migrants or political migrants. So our framework could represent all kinds of migrants, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not climate migrants as well. Any other questions?
So when we talk about climate migrants, these are mostly communities from lower income group people, right? So often these communities don't really have the access to technology and stuff like that. So how do you plan to bridge that gap to providing your solutions to those communities when they do not have the access for it?
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting question because I think a lot of our project development was based on the idea that we were trying to be as specific as possible for each case study. And the 3 that I mentioned were just 3 out of an entire 9 projects that we developed over the course of the international charrette. So initially, when we were looking at the different types of services that would be appropriate for each case study or each site, we were looking into the different access to technology and so on. So for a project like Get Up and Grow, it is not technologically based. It is based on employment. It is based on community scale interventions. It is based on creating pathways for people to implement urban greening projects in their own communities. A project like Care for You, while we do have the digital app, it actually isn't, that isn't the only aspect of the project. We want to offer a different services, especially not just in the way that maybe someone doesn't have access to technology in their own home community, for maybe an external migrant or a rural migrant, but also for people who have just faced a disaster and maybe the technology has completely gone out. You don't really have access to the physical infrastructure that you need in order to contact people. So in that case, we would be looking through an organization like the Red Cross, where they have a shelter-in-place guideline that would basically, our system would basically follow their framework in order to assess and locate our tents in the site of disaster in a predetermined safe zone. So all these different aspects, just to say, sort of helped formulate our projects in a way that they weren't technology dependent. Technology was an aspect of all of them because we have to accept the fact that many people do live in a digital world, especially our cohort of 7. We've been living in a digital world for, I guess, 8 months, and then the 9th month we all came together. So being able to address like the different needs of different communities is kind of where you start that research and develop your services. But if they have different types of needs, you can address them at different intervention points. Yes, Luigi.
Another question?
One of the things I found interesting about your presentation was how it framed the migrants as an asset. And it's interesting, you know, during the migration that we're seeing right now, first of all, the Syrian migration into Germany, it's turned out that they're contributing to the increase in German GDP. And now we're seeing a totally other migration caused by war with the Ukraine crisis, and seeing the biggest migration crisis that we've seen, you know, for probably 50 years, with, you know, 10 million people displaced. But it's interesting how you were framing, you know, people who have migrated as having skills and value that can be integrated into the society where they're going. And I think it's one of the lessons of Canada that actually when you're bringing migrants, whether they were immigrants, refugees, or potentially climate migrants, that they can actually be an asset to grow your country. So it's a way how you look at it. Can you comment more about that idea that's in your project and how you saw that working, and maybe even give an example from some of the case projects of how you were using that idea?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that core insight was really developed after we understood the different the values essentially that diversity brings to a climate ready community. So essentially when you break it down, there's 3 levels of diversity. At the very surface level, there is a level of biodiversity. And so essentially that would be our principle of apply repetition. The more species you have in the same area, the more they will be able to regenerate and sustain themselves for longer periods of time in case of systemic disruption. This principle can be applied to the other 2 facets that we were looking at, which is people and infrastructure. So I won't touch on infrastructure for now because you'll be able to see them in our posters. But we could touch on the people one because people essentially are at the core. And this idea of applying the same natural principles to the way that we see people, the way that we accept people into our communities and value people and the different skills and resources they might bring to a community was really intertwined with our idea of connecting climate migration to climate ready communities, because at the end of the day, you are looking at climate migration with all like mass movement of people. And you're saying, how do we accommodate for these people? That was like the biggest question that we had at the beginning. How do we accommodate for these people? But at the end of the day, is it really the question that I think it turned into? And I could be wrong here, it's just a little speculation. But the question that turned into is not how do we accommodate for these people? It's more, what values do these people bring to these communities? We need to accommodate for these people in order to build these climate ready communities. They're not going to exist without the inclusion of more people. And this came a lot from one of our subject matter expert interviews when we were discussing the value that migrants bring to, specifically to Toronto, but we touched a lot about the landing points of migrants, like where are climate migrants going to go? If we don't see any in this room right now, who are they? Like, where are they going? So the idea is just to continue this this journey that already kind of exists of sorry, I can't think. Basically, this journey that already exists in Toronto suburbs that have this really fascinating multi-dimensional social infrastructure that already exists. So you can see almost like enclaves of communities coming together and basically being able to form bigger communities that have a direct link to their origin communities, and kind of building off that and leveraging that social infrastructure that already exists in the GTA was sort of that first point into understanding how climate migrants will be an asset to these communities, because we already have that social infrastructure embedded into these communities. It's just about seeking them out at this point and accepting them as ingrained in our landscape almost. And I think Jenna can bring up Prince. Oh.
Yeah, and also on that note, thinking about like the storm that happened earlier. One of the things that we were talking about while developing these principles was, if people are assets, when people migrate, they also are bringing their way of solving problems. So let's say, for example, people from the Philippines or Mexico City, those are cities, Manila, let's say, those are cities where we have at least a month and a half or two of heavy rains, like the ones that we lived here, right? So when you embrace that diversity, you are also embracing the way that people are solving problems and the way that they know how to handle infrastructure to solve problems like this, so that people don't have to go 24 hours without energy. So just like translating that like a recent example. So.
Yeah, Susan.
I kind of wanted to, sorry, I love this microphone. Okay. I wanted to say that I think it's really interesting, Luigi's question and what you've done during the year, in the sense of Canada has always had open arms to immigrants, because very much later, when Harper said he's going to go hunting all over the world for good immigrants, because we have a need. We're not replacing ourselves. We have a birth rate of less than replacement of oneself. We need people in Canada to, increase our population and increase our, output for growth, to deal with our natural resources, etc. So there is a tradition from the beginning of time, when every time we need a piece of infrastructure built, we go out into the world and we figure who needs us and who do we need. And so it is a bit of usury in its worst vision, but from another lens, it's an extremely generous, open arm situation to people in trouble. So everybody's got something to share and something to give. And I think that you've really tapped into that notion in Canada in particular. I don't know who else does that in the world, but particularly Canada. And I just would like to see that featured even more in your presentation, because it is pretty special to Canada. So yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Susan. Interesting point. And there is a stereotype of the good migrant that we are conscious of in the cohort and have come across in the research that we want to be very careful of. And I think something about our principle that is very important is it's a double-edged sword, that it's not just about how migrants can help a community, but also how an existing community can help a migrant. And I think it does have to be mutual and collaborative to be effective. So just, if you'll see more in the exhibition, but that is part of our insight. Is there any other questions?
Essentially, I think what I'm trying to understand is something similar to what was just asked, or maybe a follow-up, but with the strong migrants, like you mentioned, there's also going to be in today's world, and this can seem like a negative question, but in today's world too, when you're migrating countries, sometimes children will apply for their parents to come as dependents. And then there are also other dependents that you will probably bring with you, which possibly do not provide as much of a resource in a way. You can see that as that, right? There's people who sometimes, of course, everybody has a skill and everybody has their value and things like that. But at the same time, there are going to be people that don't want to provide back and they just want to take. How do you or how did you address that group of the population, I guess? Does that make sense? I mean, I don't want to sound negative, but I know that that is a huge part of the population as well.
Yeah, I think it's just the idea that in a way it's quantifying what resources a migrant can bring to a new community, and not considering what I mentioned before, this social value of bringing families in. The more families that we have, the more social infrastructure we will build, the more community outreach we will have, the more we'll be able to build grassroots movements that cater to family needs, cater to emotional needs. I think there's maybe, which you'll see with the posters, there is an equal value on emotional tensions for migrants as much, and social tensions, as much as there is on economic tensions. And we kind of have to balance these two. What is a migrant looking for when they might be moving to Canada? A climate migrant in particular, they're probably looking for some sort of, some form of dignified work, some form of employment. But this dignified work comes from the idea of being able to provide for yourself, and this emotional labor you take onto yourself in order to sort of be sufficient. And without in the case of bringing, like, let's say only one migrant in who can provide labor, for example, we are completely undermining the fact that isolation is a huge crisis among newcomers in this country, and creating structures or systems and services that kind of dissuade this isolation, this social isolation, and promote the social value that migrants can bring, and migrants and their families and dependents can bring to these communities should not be reduced to a quantifiable resource, I believe.
I think I'll take this opportunity to congratulate you guys, because I think it's the topic that you're discussing. World Economic Forum met a couple of days ago, and I think it's still very hot on their agenda. The things that you've shed a light on today, I've been talking about this in international relations for almost 6-7 years now. And what I see in this presentation today is it's a good thing to pilot on climate migrants, but I see a lot more application here. All the vulnerable population that could benefit from this, the whole scope and the applicability of this is massive. So it's a good starting point, but for climate migrants, but I see that the work that you guys have done and the depth that you guys have presented, a lot of other vulnerable communities can benefit from this. So I congratulate you all.
Thank you. Just as a note to that, one of our key principles is eliminate exposures for those who are vulnerable in our own communities as well. So think of just houseless populations who are experiencing the worst of climate effects right now. They also need to be sort of like given, they need services to be provided for them to assess their climate risk and adequately prevent climate risk or climate related injury. So I think it's one of those core tensions of being able to understand that vulnerable populations all around the world are not necessarily going to be migrants who are at risk of climate effects. They are going to be the people within our own communities. And how can we create systems that are both adequately going to address the needs of the people who might want to move because of that, who might feel compelled to move, or the people who cannot move or might want to stay. So it's just kind of being able to understand these varying impacts and design for them and build for them. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's all the time we have today for questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was a really great turnout. I would like to invite everyone to come see the presentation space or the exhibit space, which is upstairs. And I guess the students will lead.